When I saw Ashley had messaged about Baldwin, I was expecting Alec Baldwin to start in with a voiceover. And I was like, what on earth is Alec Baldwin doing with this project?
That was the 50s. It was a crazy time. Welcome back to Shat on TV Lovecraft Country, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the new HBO series, Lovecraft Country. I am one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my co-hosts, Ashley Schlafly.
Hi, y'all.
And the unassailable King B.
Classic sweaters of the 60s.
And this is our very first deep dive episode for Lovecraft Country, where we look back on this week's episode of Lovecraft Country and provide our thoughts and analysis, plus the top listener emails and voicemail for the week. This week's episode was episode 1, Sundown. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode. You can do that wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting shatontv.com/subscribe. And if you joined us on Sunday for Lovecraft Live, our instant reaction show on Twitch, thank you so much for joining us to do that. If you haven't checked it out already, you can find that at shatontv.com/Twitch. And those episodes are good for about a week. They'll stay on Twitch. And if you can't find them there, go to YouTube. They're all there as well. That's youtube.com/shatontv. So, King B, Ash, we did our very first Twitch live stream. We talked about our feelings about the first episode. We probably won't be doing much of that today, but it may seep out again as we respond to listener mail and other things. What stood out to you most about this episode?
So I read a really great review, a positive review of this show on Vulture's website. They're doing some pretty good rundowns of HBO shows lately. And so I checked them out, and I think it was pretty cool because they talked about how the thing that this critic loved the most of episode 1 was the number of fuck yous that are in this episode. And they're kind of glorious, this amount of fuck yous that are actually really funny. And they're mostly coming from Atticus. Got to get used to calling him Tick with the nickname that he has on the show. So they're mostly coming from Tick. And so from the reopening of the fire hydrant after the cop shuts it down, the actual yelling of shoot the motherfucker to the cop, the look he gives the military recruiter, which is very much a fuck you. They're just kind of a plenty in this episode, and they're a lot of fun. So when I rewatched the episode, I found myself enjoying the comedic value of those fuck yous. And it reminded me so much of the reasons why I love the movies like Get Out and Us that have this really smart comedy. And so I'm really looking forward to that kind of tonality moving ahead with the rest of the season. And even more so the second time, I could feel Jordan Peele all over this episode. And that made me really happy and kind of excited to see what the next 9 are going to bring.
My favorite moment of the episode, except for maybe the James Baldwin voiceover, was Letitia's "get your ass up, we got to get the fuck out of here now" line from the diner scene. That is something we definitely did not get from the novel. It was a very different kind of attitude. It was very much more in your face, and it was something to celebrate, something I really enjoyed. I'm really glad you brought that up. For me, the thing that stood out to me the most was the pace of the episode. Horror, at least the kind of horror that I appreciate, is so dependent on suspense. And then you have that release of the sheer terror. And I was curious about why the showrunners chose such a breakneck pace for this story. We're in Kentucky one second, then it's Chicago, now it's Simmonsville, there's a street party, then it's a car crash, there's a monster chase. And I think that 2 things really explain these decisions. One is that it's 2020. We're in an era of TikTok and short attention spans. And even listeners who joined us Sunday night for Lovecraft Live on Twitch expressed that they were worried from the trailers, from the HBO trailers, that this show would be slow and boring, which I didn't get from the trailers. But if people had that feeling, then I could see why it's in the showrunner's best interest to accelerate things. And the second point is that I think we all assumed that Lovecraft Country would be this grave and morose retelling of Jim Crow America, with some monsters added in. And we never really took the time to ask the show what it wanted to be. Not that they would have responded to us, but maybe the show is something different from what we expected. Maybe Lovecraft Country wants to be a monster a week, and then there are some heroes who are Black in a historical setting. Like maybe that's the show. We just don't know it yet. In hindsight, I feel kind of silly and myopic with all the assumptions I'd lumped on Misha Green and HBO.
I definitely agree. We all came into this with some sort of expectation. And I guess really we had no right to assume as such, because when we look at the trailers that were released or any of the materials that were released for this, they really didn't give us a whole lot of info. We didn't really know what we were walking into. While I do feel that the show is struggling to maybe find its footing, its pace, the theme, the message, while we're waiting for all those things to solidify, I am still going to focus on just how good the show looks. Everyone's costumes, the block party scene, the scenery is lush and alive, and it breathes and it moves. It's got that HBO polish to it, ignoring the rubber arm that we found on the forest floor. And it comes down to, shirtless Atticus, and she dares wear short shorts, Letitia, and George, who I'm really excited to see the finest sweater collection this side of Mr. Rogers coming out of that guy.
Well, I think the overall feeling on the opening episode 1, Sundown of Lovecraft Country, is positive. If you haven't listened to our podcast before, thanks for tuning in. And on Shat on TV, we do things a little bit differently. So we're not going to go scene by scene, but instead we're going to talk about some big topics or themes from the show. In today's pod, we are going over some of the nods and references Lovecraft Country makes. People noticed that there were all sorts of things thrown at us from Americana, and King B is going to take a look at what some of those things meant. I'm going to talk about Letitia as a character and the voice of 2020 culture. Ash is going to get into Lovecraft and Baldwin, both heavy topics there. And of course, we have a slew of letters and voicemail, including a voicemail that takes me to task and champions Ash, something we always love on the pod. So without further ado, though, King B, if you wouldn't mind getting us started on that opening sequence that we saw in Sundown.
So our episode starts with some pretty vivid and drastic visuals. This is all Atticus's dream sequence as he's sleeping on the bus. First thing you hear is that audio excerpt. And this is from a recording of the story of Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson is popularly known as the first African-American to play in white baseball. There were two others that came decades before him. Apologies to Moses Fleetwood Walker and William Edward White, two guys I learned about doing a little bit of research. We've got Atticus in trench warfare of what we're going to assume to be the Korean conflict that he just got home from. As the camera pans out, you've got these nondescript UFOs that are coming in off the horizon. Those basic UFOs are a staple of all the old sci-fi movies. And then you've got those tripods from the Orson Welles War of the World. Orson Welles obviously wrote that famous radio play War of the Worlds about an attack from Mars, the giant tripods that just decimated U.S. soldiers. You also see these what look almost like Roman gladiators or soldiers fighting these American soldiers using swords and non-traditional weaponry. While they might look like gladiators, I believe that what we're actually looking at is Barsoomian warriors. Now, Barsoom or Barsoomians are the fictional race that lives on Mars. And those were created by the author Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Rice Burroughs was an incredibly prolific author who created Tarzan. He created John Carter. He's got a million other characters, but the John Carter books were really kind of his meal ticket back in the day before Tarzan took off. Now, the big thing that I found kind of interesting or really got me thinking a lot was that princess that kind of beams down from that UFO. I say princess because who I believe she is actually a representation of Dejah Thoris. Dejah Thoris was the Princess of Mars. That was Edgar Rice Burroughs' first Martian book about the adventures of John Carter. And she was the love interest. She was a leader on this planet. She was sort of the catalyst to get John Carter involved in this huge conflict that took place on Mars. Now, why that's interesting to me is that in the books written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, a white guy from the early 1900s, he describes this woman as this exotic, unearthly beauty with skin of a light reddish copper color. And for 100 years, or as long as these books have been out, they've also come out as illustrated volumes. And for 100 years, drawn by white dudes, Dejah Thoris, a Martian hottie with red skin, was always portrayed as a straight up white lady with black hair. She had sort of exotic eyebrows sometimes, or she was always very lurid and lavishly clad, very incredibly sexy and exotic and strange, but always decidedly a white chick. But Atticus's Dejah Thoris, the one that he envisions from the books that he reads, isn't this big, busty, billowy thing. She's got straight up maroon skin. And I think it's kind of interesting that, having seen the illustrations of this character as presented by white dudes, always being a white woman, and then you give a young black man who's very steeped in fiction and having traveled, the world, the idea of an exotic beauty to him with copper colored skin seems like a very genuine way to portray his vision for what this character is and display how a black man might differently view the descriptions written in a book of a fictional character than the white guys that have been drawing it for years.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And a big shout out to Jamie Chung, who actually plays this character in the beginning. She is a Korean American actress and actually got her start on The Real World on MTV back in 2004. But she's actually a fantastic actress, and I was excited to see her. And I'm hoping that you're right, that this ideal woman is going to come back. Maybe that lady that he's calling in Korea, who knows? Maybe she's a less maroon version in real life. But Jamie Chung is great, and I was excited to see her and excited to see this ideal woman for Atticus that kind of combines the Korean experience along with this the Korean War experience along with this sci-fi love and experience he's had since he was a kid. I think you're really onto something there.
Speaking of that unexpected star power on the episode, Journey Smollett Bell of True Blood fame, who plays Letitia in this episode, we'd kind of highlighted her on the preview. And in the preview, we said that we'd like to learn more about this character and see her used more because she's fun, she's glamorous, she's a bit of a firebrand. And episode 1 on that note did not disappoint. Letitia is beyond outspoken for the 50s. And I felt like she's even more than that as a character. They're really extending the intent here and making her almost like a borderline time traveler. She doesn't feel like something from the 50s. She drops that line, Letitia fucking Lewis. She is that voice of Black Lives Matter. She is that voice of Me Too. She is this voice that intends to jump a few generations ahead in the struggles that she's facing. And what's really cool about Lovecraft Country is how intersectional it is, right? We talked about a little about that in the preview with, Atticus is a Black man in Jim Crow era. He's also a bibliophile. He's also a veteran. Here we have Letitia at the same time. She's not just a Black woman passively experiencing these times, but rather she is kind of a forward-thinking revolutionary of sorts. Her language feels much more 2020 to me than 1950. So I'm almost starting to review this character of Letitia as sort of a reverse anachronism, right? Like she is out of place even among her peers. And I think it's pretty cool. We also see that argument that she has with her brother Marvin kind of off screen inside the house. And we get these little tidbits of information that Letitia, is probably involved in the civil rights movement. She's helping bail people out. She's using her own money to do that. And it's giving more credence to this idea of her being something more than just someone along for the ride. The show also takes care to highlight that, like, she's not supposed to drive. And then we get that great line in the diner, get your ass up. We got to get the fuck out of here now. And again, that feels like something we'd be screaming, you and I, at the screen today, instead of something a woman would be screaming to her travel companions in a small diner in the 50s. Another thing I just wanted to note was about the sexuality in this show. I think that there's a little more of it than I anticipated. But there's this bizarre dynamic between Letitia and Atticus. Her interactions with Atticus are atypical for TV. Normally, you have two very good-looking young stars. They're on screen together, and we're supposed to see those sparks flying, right? And yeah, she's got that camera. She's sitting on the car. She's admiring his physical form while he's shirtless. But they're more of a team. Like, she doesn't seem like the lady hanging off of his arm. I could see this whole series going by without anything particularly sexual happening between the two of them.
It's pretty great that they're doing that they have such a kind of multi-dimensional woman in Letitia's character, because the source material for this, Lovecraft, is not known for writing women well, other than writing them in kind of these one-dimensional ways, which I think is a really good transition into the importance of who Lovecraft is. I mean, obviously the show is called Lovecraft Country, and so we've gotten some questions on our Twitch stream and also just online and social media asking us to dive a little bit into who Lovecraft is, because if you're not a sci-fi fan, there's a pretty good possibility that you've never actually read anything that Lovecraft wrote before. But he is a pretty prolific writer, especially for what is called the weird fiction genre that was kind of developed around his style of writing. And he has inspired a number of writers that have gone on to be famous even through to today. But I'll just go ahead and just say it as bluntly as I can. You may like his writing, but the guy was not a good guy. We talked about on the preview about how he was really a consummate racist, and proof of that is a poem that is actually mentioned in this episode. It was written in 1912, and it is called On the Creation of the N-Word, and it's awful. It's very short. I considered reading it here because it's only about 8 lines, but I didn't want to give more power to his words. So basically, the juxta of the whole thing is that it's talking about how God created beast, and then God thought he needed something else, so he took mankind's image. Lovecraft says it was filled with vice, and that is what they then called the N-word. And it's disgusting. It's as disgusting as it sounds. And what I think we learn in this episode, not just about Lovecraft, but about his kind of history and his fame, is that we learn how awful he is, while at the same time learning a lot in one small moment about Atticus's upbringing and his father, who we've yet to meet, and Montrose, because of the fact that Montrose made Atticus memorize this poem as a punishment of sorts for reading Lovecraft. It shows us that his father was saying, hey, listen, this guy's horrible. He hates people like you, but you're supporting him by reading him. And why are you doing that? Be conscious, at least, of what you're doing by making him read the utter worst of what Lovecraft had to say on the issue of race in America.
Ash, on Lovecraft Live on Twitch, you brought up Atticus's statement about stories being like people, where they are imperfect but still loved. And I've been thinking about that, and it's so true about everything around us, because to be the other in any sense, whether it's racially or sexually or in your abilities or your religion or myriad other ways, to be the other is to have your creativity and your imagination and your self-image and your government all impacted by the works of people who are racists and homophobes and misogynists and ableists and bigots, right? So we all grew up, all three of us and everybody listening, in these constructs that were set up before us by people, hopefully, who are a lot worse than us. And yet at the same time, we can make them our own with our own imagination, our own love, our own sensibilities. And that's the interesting part, is that struggle between Atticus and his father, which we are seeing develop here. Is it okay to stand on the shoulders of awful people, or to have your heroes be heroes in your eyes, but spawn from the original imagination of someone terrible? I thought it was one of the deeper points of the episode.
Yeah, I'm really glad you bring up the whole concept of othering, because we see another text by Lovecraft throughout this episode, and it is one of arguably his most famous works, and it's called The Outsider and Others. And this is kind of a critical text to understanding why Lovecraft was and is so big. It is a famous collection of short stories, including some of Lovecraft's most famous, such as The Call of Cthulhu. And before we get actuallys, y'all, I listened to 4 YouTube videos today about how Lovecraft actually intended for that to be pronounced. But Cthulhu, whatever, it's a really famous short story by him. But the other thing that this book, The Outsider and Others, is really famous for is that all of these racist overtones and feelings that Lovecraft has can be found within the short stories within this book through this othering that happens, or this fear of others that Lovecraft writes about. So when he writes his weird fiction and talks of horror, it's about invaders into America and the horrors of other races and race mixing, oh my, and how horrible that sounds to him. And so the imagery for Tick here, I think, is huge, because we see him reading this, but he's shown throughout the rest of the episode legitimately being othered. He is the outsider. He is a Black man in Jim Crow America, and that connection, they're obviously making very clear for us here that he's reading about others through Lovecraft while also being othered throughout his, just experience walking through his daily life. And the final connection that we wanted to bring up with the outsider and others is the name Arkham. So in the episode, Atticus says that his dad, he initially thinks that the letter says that his dad is in Arkham, Massachusetts, which is why he says he's in, quote, Lovecraft Country. And the reason for that is because the small press that published a lot of Lovecraft's writing is called Arkham. And you can see that very clearly on the spine of the copy of The Outsider and Others that Atticus is reading in this episode. And if that name sounds familiar to you and you're not a fan of Lovecraft, well, maybe you're a fan of Batman, because the DC universe and Batman's Arkham Asylum, the insane asylum within Gotham City, is actually, the name is taken from Lovecraft. Arkham comes from the Lovecraft world, and it's a reference to Lovecraft and this idea of insanity and madness. That's a common theme throughout most of Lovecraft stories.
It's important to note also, if you didn't catch it during the episode, that Atticus and company are headed to Ardham. They're headed to Ardham, Massachusetts, not Arkham. That's not the place they're going. And the reason for that miscommunication is that Atticus's dad and George's brother, Montrose, which Ash referenced before, he has really wacky handwriting. I mean, it's pretty shit. And so Atticus is having a hard time reading it. If you're watching that scene, you thought, it's weird that Atticus has trouble reading. He reads just fine. He's a book lover. We can tell because he's got glasses, right? I mean, that's how TV tells you that. Thought it was interesting that they left that detail, in the show.
Well, I think they have to. Otherwise, why is it called Lovecraft Country? I think it's much more obvious why it's called that, to leave the Arkham in, which I wonder that myself. And I was like, oh, so I am glad that little tidbit, but that's a great point, Gene, that it isn't Arkham, it's Ardham. And leaving Lovecraft behind, there's another big writer that's involved in this episode that I think kind of blew us all away because we weren't expecting this reference to be in this episode. And that is the voiceover that tons of news outlets are writing about today that comes from James Baldwin. So Lovecraft Country, the show, takes place in the 1950s, and this voiceover is a bit out of time to be included here because it is from a debate that James Baldwin did with William F. Buckley actually in 1965. So it happened after the events of what we're seeing, but it is a brilliant way to explain what is happening on screen. The speech, the debate, the piece that James Baldwin is speaking from here, we now know this as the American Dream and the American Negro. But if you're not familiar with it, basically Buckley was a white conservative that was debating James Baldwin at Cambridge University in 65. And they were both responding to one very simple question, which was, is the American dream that we talk about, that we want, is it achieved at the expense of Black people within the United States? And I think what's really interesting here is that the showrunners are using Baldwin's answer to that question, which is a resounding, yes, it is achieved at the disadvantage of Black people. It is achieved at their expense. And they're showing us that with this imagery of Jim Crow segregation and white people very much not operating within the same constraints as our Black leads and all other Black people that were living in America at the time.
I've been a Baldwin fan since I first read Giovanni's Room. That was the first time I was exposed to his writing. And I never heard him speak at that point. I'd only read him. It was a book that was given to me by a friend. And when I read that book, I couldn't believe it was written by who it was, when it was. Like, you guys got to understand, this was an openly gay Black intellectual writing a book in 1956 about relationships with men in Paris. And he's very vulnerable in it. He's very earnest in it. And it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. And I'm not saying that to be like, oh, I'm Gene, I read books. No, but literally it is in any degree of the examination of love and fondness for people, this book is up there at the top of the list. Up until this point of this voiceover in the episode, I felt very little other than amusement. Like I was having a good time. I was watching the show, but it wasn't hitting me, you know? And again, I understand. I'm an Iranian American at 40 years old living in the suburbs of Chandler, Arizona. Maybe this show is not made specifically to engender feelings in me, but this did. I was crying within 5 seconds. You texted us a little bit beforehand, so I saw your message and I was like, there's a Baldwin, voiceover, and then boom, it hit. Baldwin is just such a gorgeous spirit with such an unmistakable voice and unmistakable cadence. And that voiceover was done to incredible effect. And King B, you talked about how beautiful the show is. I think some of the most gorgeous imagery and revolting imagery at the same time was during this scene.
When I saw Ashley had messaged about Baldwin, I was expecting Alec Baldwin to start in with a voiceover. And I was like, what on earth is Alec Baldwin doing with this project?
That was the 50s. It was a crazy time.
Well, the other thing that I think is great is that James Baldwin has recently made kind of a resurgence in pop culture with the success of, for example, the movie If Beale Street Could Talk. I think that, with the Academy Award nominated documentary film, I Am Not Your Negro. I mean, we've all been kind of talking about Baldwin again, and we should always be talking about James Baldwin because he is such a beautiful spirit. And what he provides for us here, what Baldwin's words do, is they do provide that imagery that you're talking about. And there's a lot to unpack in the speech, which we just don't have time for. But basically, I want to kind of land on one thing that he says, which is that the answer to the question of, is the American dream achieved at the expense of Black people? Baldwin says the answer has to do with one system of reality. So it's basically our perception of the world and our circumstances. Think about it. They are what define our reality. And so there are many images here to show us that disparate reality. And I couldn't help but think about our modern world. And I think that it's one of the reasons why privilege is really hard for some people to identify, because we see our world, we see our circumstance, and you have to be taught to see others and the effect our world has on these others. And that happens here. And I'll just talk about 3 images in this episode. The first is there's this idyllic 1950s hot dog stand where the white children are being served while this impatient Black man and his family are forced to wait. The second is this great billboard with a white family in this gorgeous new car with that tagline that says, "There's no way like the American way." And that's juxtaposed with this long line of Black people waiting for a bus with no shade from the sun. Who knows when that bus is coming? And then the third, while not a direct image, is this irony that's already talked about in this episode about how Tick is a veteran and he fought for Americans' freedoms, but he's unable to even be served in restaurants alongside white clientele. And I think that the showrunners are brilliant to show us just how correct Baldwin's words in 1965 were, and combine that with these present debates that we're having today about school funding, about access to technology, about police brutality. And this part of the show resonated for me, not just in this 1950s setting, not just in the real life of 1965 when Baldwin is making this speech, but here in 2020 today as well, which is what I'm hoping will be the power of this show, is more images and connections like this moving forward.
Now, Ash, it wouldn't be an episode of Shat on TV without a voicemail coming in, and specifically coming for me. So guys, if you would like to call in and share your voicemail with us, we love to hear your voices and share them on the podcast. You can call 914-719-SHAT with your thoughts. This one comes from a listener in Bermuda, and she just had some praise for you and some not so kind words for old Gene Lyons.
Hi guys, this is Tawana from Bermuda. This is my second time calling. I called once during the this past season of Westworld, but I've been a fan of you guys for your entire Westworld run and Game of Thrones. And I just listened to your intro and then the primer on Lovecraft Country, which I read. It's not my favorite Matt Roth book. My favorite Matt Roth book is probably Bad Monkeys. But Lovecraft Country was impactful. I mean, I just loved it, but, I'm a Black woman, so I think it probably held a lot of significance to me, the parallels between, Lovecraft, his racist tale and, just racism in general, and then the actual monsters, who are the monsters. But I said all of that to say, and I digress. I'm really concerned about your coverage of this series. Even just listen to your primer, and one of the podcast hosts asked if he should read Green Book to find out about watch Green Book to find out about African American history. And I was like, what the hell am I hearing? Could you be that ignorant? To think that anything produced by Hollywood could give you any type of decent insight into such serious issues. And I'm really glad that Ashley kind of set him straight on that and basically said, go to Wikipedia, mate. And she's completely right. But it's even just the lack of, any explanation on the Green Book. Yes, okay, yeah, it guided you through Jim Crow South. Jim Crow America, but it actually extended throughout the world. It was a travel book, a large part sponsored by Eastern Airlines at the time, who were trying to motivate Black Americans to travel outside of America and actually extend it to other countries as well. So, to me, there are so many issues if the show follows the book that require a deeper understanding of African American history and experience that I think that the three of you perhaps are not equipped to discuss. That although I love listening to your podcast, I have to say I do have a bit of bated breath because I just don't know. I'm like, what the fuck are they going to say? I hope they don't say no dumb shit. Anyway, so those are my thoughts. Take it or leave it. Do this it what you will. Anyway, thanks for giving us good content, guys. You keep it interesting. That's one thing. Take care.
Just to leap to Gene's defense, I think if a person asks a question in earnest, you cannot label them as ignorant. Ignorance is to make a statement or to make an assumption or make a claim without knowledge. But if you're genuinely wanting to know if you can get one thing out of another because you don't have the answers or you don't know, I don't really feel that that's ignorance.
I'll be honest. I was fucking livid when I got this voicemail. And I was like, I am just going to play the primer, the episode of Shat on TV that you're referencing to show exactly what the fuck I said so that you know exactly what the fuck I was talking about. And then I went back and, let's all do it together. Let's all take a step back. We're going to go back 2 weeks in time and listen to exactly what I said. The Oscar-winning film, The Green Book, has also been tied to this series. Now, I haven't seen it, but I heard that The Green Book is horribly overrated. And I do plan to watch it before Lovecraft Country debuts just to get a better idea of what this book is all about. The Green Book, for those that don't know, is this travel guide that outlines safe or dangerous places for Black motorists in Jim Crow America. And it plays a huge role in Lovecraft Country. Ash, do you think it's worth watching to understand what Lovecraft Country is all about? So, Tawana, you're right. I sound like I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about because I'm like, should I watch this movie to explain this book to me? What I should have said was that I've been doing research on Lovecraft Country, and in doing so, literally at least 5, probably like 8 different articles that I read kept referencing the Green Book. Why? Probably because it's topical and an Oscar winner. And I was like, is it really worth watching? Because I've only heard horrible things about it. So I was asking people who had seen the movie, should I watch this in preparation for Lovecraft Country? Is it worth watching? And in fact, the genesis of that was more me being skeptical of the movie, not being excited about it.
Quick question, Gene. Did anyone actually recommend that you see that movie?
No.
It is the biggest white savior piece of shit I ever watched, and I was fucking livid the whole time.
To Tawana's point, I think it's important. I mean, I think sometimes we forget what we address on Twitch versus what we address actually like recorded on the air because we spend so much time on Twitch, Gene. I mean, especially you and I mean, we're on there 3 days a week, and with the King Bee, you're on there 4 days a week, right? It's a big part of our lives. And so I think sometimes you forget where you said things. And I think, Tawana, what you're saying about your trepidation, we very much have felt ourselves. I can't speak for anyone else on this podcast but myself, but I am someone that does not go into things without fully thinking things through. And when we thought about, okay, what next show are we going to do? One of the first things that came to mind was the show. And we waited another 2 months before actually deciding to do it, because Jean and I took the time to read the book. We did a bunch of research. We talked to people. We talked to our audience that includes people from all backgrounds, including many people that are people of color and many people that aren't. And we had a big conversation. It was like, is this something that we can do in a way that pays homage to the show and that ensures that we are keeping ourselves at a distance enough to say we can't understand these things? And can we bring in voices to help us fill in those holes that you're very much correct about, that we're not going to have the connotation and the context for, right? And so I appreciate your having said that. And that's why when I heard the voicemail, I sent it. I was like, you have to listen to this voicemail and we have to play it, because of the fact that we want to make sure that voices like yours get heard. Because as a woman of color, we need to know, where are we fucking up? Where are we missing things? Where are the holes in our logic and our research? And thank you so much for trying to point that out to us. And that's why we played the voicemail. I hope you see that, because even if it's critical of us, none of us have thin skin. We're all here to do the best job we can reporting on this show. And we are here to do this collectively as a community. We may be the mouthpieces, but nothing we do is in isolation. So please, everybody out there, write in, host at shatontv.com, call in to 914-719-SHAT and leave us more voicemails so we can make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable to do good podcasting and to do this show justice for everybody.
One of my main buckets for this week was actually to talk about the Negro Motorist Green Book. Real briefly, if you didn't get it on Twitch or during our primer episode, this was a book that was published actually from the mid-30s to the mid-60s and helped motorists understand where it was relatively safe to stop, also where to eat and where to even sleep, right? Like, where is safe lodging? It also had some other safety tips, which are horrifying to think about, which is have a chauffeur's cap handy in case you need to masquerade like it's not your vehicle or you're out there in the service of a white person. Moving into episode 1, we got this topic of sundown towns or sundown counties. Lovecraft Country is doing for sundown towns or sundown counties what Watchmen did for the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, which is basically getting all eyes on it via HBO as a vehicle. So what these things are, and they existed well into the 60s, there are still thousands of them in America, is a city where if you were non-white, and not just black, but non-white, you had to leave the city limits by dusk, or you could be picked up by police, or you could be harassed or meet violence. Lots of bad things could happen to you. And just because the sun was up, it didn't mean a sundown town was a cool place to be. The idea was to be as inhospitable as possible all the time. Nightfall just gave them a pretense for stops. This system allowed so that you can have Black Americans or Asian Americans come in as labor. They're just not your neighbors, right? The understanding was you got to get out of town, before the sun goes down. Where it touches specifically in the show too is we see early in episode 1, Sundown, that Diane is doing these drawings in the guide, and you see these trolls and other things drawn on the pages. So it's not just a normal map. So those trolls, they're barbarous, unthinking monsters. And that's not meant to show actual trolls, but rather that this is the way that people are behaving in this area, right? You might get a sheriff that's you're going to meet with violence, but they're not really the thinky type. Whereas we also get these hooded figures that are shown in this episode, and that might suggest more mystical events. And so it's kind of an illustrated almanac of travel for the purposes of this show.
Also, there are these little nuggets that were kind of dropped throughout the episode that are kind of cool references. And one of them that I found most interesting is Denmark Vesey. So the bar that Atticus stops at to look for Montrose, his father, is called Denmark Vesey's Bar. This is a reference to the real life Denmark Vesey, who was executed in 1822. So Denmark Vesey was a free Black man that worked as a carpenter in Charleston, South Carolina, and he helped to plan a slave rebellion of what is said to have been thousands of slaves that were ready to participate. And because of the number of people who knew, eventually word got out. The slave owners, put to rest their plans, and they executed Vesey and others, deported others, including Vesey's son, basically to kind of, stall out the whole thing and get control again. But I thought that this was a really interesting reference and Easter egg, and I think we're going to see these throughout. And I'm excited to learn things like about sundown towns, like about Denmark Vesey, that I wouldn't have known prior to watching the show.
Guys, I haven't been to a bar since the start of the pandemic, and there is nothing in the world like an old Chicago bar. The temperature in there is always right. There's this soothing electricity to them. The smell is always the same. I was taken right back there. And again, King B, like you said, it just speaks to how well the show is shot and how much care they put into every backdrop.
Well, and the second nugget is we see a copy of Weird Tales in this episode. And this was something that one of our listeners asked specifically to hear about on this episode. And so Weird Tales is actually an important publication to the sci-fi culture. It was published from 1923 to 1954. So many of your science fiction or your geeky kind of type writers were inspired by Weird Tales. Lovecraft was published many times within it, as was Ray Bradbury, who kind of had a few references this episode, and I think it's going to continue to be referenced. And it's also actually the first publication that was called quote unquote weird fiction, which is what defines Lovecraft and the other type of literature that Tick is really into and that we find out that Uncle George is into as well. And then the final nugget that we wanted to talk about is actually something that came to us from a listener. Big shout out to Tom from Chicago, who, like 2 minutes after the episode was over, had his first email in, and it was fantastic. I got really excited to see one come in. And he sent us some research about why it's critical, this block party scene, for us to see where our characters are living and kind of congregating together within Chicago. And there's this neighborhood called Bronzeville or Black Metropolis, or it's also called the Black Belt. And it's a part of Chicago's South Side. And it's incredibly important to African-American history, particularly within Chicago. So beginning in 1916, African-Americans left the South in droves, and a lot of them came to Chicago because of this promise for better jobs and for less oppression. And there were tons of community connections there. It was a fully established community, full-fledged business culture, community culture, and it existed without racial restrictions that were seen elsewhere within Chicago. And this neighborhood still exists to this day. And I think it's important, thank you, Tom, for pointing out that that's where this block party and this community is taking place that we find our characters in at the start of our episode.
I admittedly don't know a ton about the South Side. I lived in Logan Square, so there wasn't the same makeup. It was mostly a Puerto Rican neighborhood, and now I think it's pretty much almost all white. But interesting fact about Bronzeville, which does have a very storied history and very rich history, is that the desegregation of housing in Chicago actually is what sent Bronzeville into a decline for a while. Bronzeville was really created as this sort of a stronghold and an epicenter of Black culture because the Black community couldn't move to other parts of Chicago. Once they desegregated Chicago, the upper and middle class Black families with more mobility left, and then the average income per household dipped in the neighborhood and it kind of slid into a bit of disrepair. But good news is it is making a comeback. So thanks, Tom, for writing in. We have a couple other letters that came in. If you'd like to write in to us, you can write us at hosts@shatontv.com. We may read your email on the air. So if you don't want to read on the air, make sure you note that in your email, and also let us know what to call you. That'll help us a lot. And our first letter comes from Susan in State College.
Hello, Ashley, Jean, and King B. The Eldritch horror part of the show seems to work better than the racist horror in the show. The most glaring moment, in my opinion, was at the diner. Here are three people that live with overt and fatal racism every day. George publishes a book on how to travel safely in the United States for Black travelers. While Atticus thinks staying to eat at the diner is a bad idea, George points out that they're citizens and Atticus is a military veteran, and why shouldn't they expect to be served? Really? Okay, the diner didn't have whites only signs, but really? It felt very out of character at this point in the show and rather forced. Susan from State College.
One of the things that popped out to me was if they're doing this research for where African American travelers will be safe to stop and eat, it seemed readily apparent from the get-go that this was not one of those places. And I would have spun out of my heels right there and taken off. Now, it's not wrong that he took a stand, but it does seem counterintuitive to the guy's goal.
I did personally find that one of the coolest reveals was in this part where he slides back the tile all like slickly and like you see that it's burnt underneath, and that realization that happens right away. I thought that reveal and the pacing of this scene actually worked really, really well. But I do agree with you, Susan. I was like, what are they? I got nervous. I was like, what are they doing? Why are they doing this? Because I was afraid that, something would clearly happen to them.
They had a tip to stop at this place because they were supposed to check it out because it was supposed to be safe. Now, when they got there, that's when they noticed that, like Ash mentioned, that the floor underneath and that the walls were painted white because there had been a fire. So something bad had happened there prior to their arrival. So it was supposed to be safe, but it wasn't. I hope that helps explain it, Susan. But you're absolutely right on a lot of points there. Next up, we have a letter from Ryan from Dallas.
Hey, crew. So nice to have you all back. I can't believe I would be in this position, but I agree with King B after the Instacast. I want this show to be phenomenal, but I don't know if it's going to satisfy that desire. I absolutely love The Watchmen and champion any show that has the courage to address racial issues or any other issue, both past and present, in intriguing and character-driven ways. This show, at least after the first episode, has traded character depth for plot-driven repetition of white people terrorizing our protagonist. Any attempt to look for symbolism yields the most heavy-handed, even more racist results. I haven't read the book, so feel free to not read this if it's somehow accurate. I hope it isn't. Take, for instance, the monsters. They seem to be ultra-violent racists lurking in the dark. If normal white racists are bitten, they will turn into these monsters. However, the tool that will ward off these murder-starved creatures is light, as in shine a light on these racists and they will retreat because they are cowards who publicly deny their hate, but will privately let it consume them, especially at night, especially when surrounded by their own kind. It was pretty obvious the monsters on the map indicate where the most violent racists are, and therefore where to avoid. It seems as if this show wants to win the award for the most white guilt-induced. Again, I hope this series will delve deeper into its characters, far beyond the surface-level introductions we have received. The on-the-season promo at the end was very enticing. And Michael K. Williams is one of my favorite actors, and of course, the Shat crew is covering it. All the best, Ryan from Dallas.
Well, Ryan, thanks for writing in. I can't believe I'm in this position, but I don't believe that I entirely agree with you agreeing with me. I wouldn't call it repetitive white people terrorizing our protagonists. That's just the time and place and the setting. I mean, I didn't expect anyone else to be harassing them. There's no rogue band of Chineses chasing them around making trouble. I also think you might be looking a little too hard for depth and symbolism with the whole sheriffs versus monsters thing. Eldritch horrors infecting people with bites or attacks was a commonplace theme in Lovecraft and Lovecraftian-inspired beasts. And one of the things that you'll come to see when it comes to these ancient horrors and elder gods is they are completely indifferent to race or creed. These are cosmic dimensional entities. We are simply food. You don't care what color your cheeseburger was when it had 4 legs, and these creatures don't see anything in you beyond genetic material for their digestive tract. So maybe just take it for a monster story filled with a bunch of racists.
I think that, you say here that the show wants to win the award for the most white guilt induced. I mean, there should be tremendous guilt for what happened during this time period. So I don't think that they can overload on that, because what happened to people like Atticus, like the real life people, that's still happening today is absolutely horrendous. And so I don't have a problem with that. But as far as the metaphor and the figurative, imagery that you're looking at here, I mean, I was more upset and I said this on Twitch, about them calling these vampires than I was about anything else. I mean, I'm still harping on it, guys, because I still have a problem with them being called vampires, and about the light, artificial light. I'll say that again, artificial light making them go away. But, I mean, I don't think necessarily that we can judge anything about the overall tonality in terms of what they're going to do with racism here. And Watchmen was pretty heavy-handed with some of their stuff too, and it worked. So I don't think heavy-handedness innately means that it's not going to be effective.
There's a scene in that HBO show, The Outsider, where the strange investigator lady meets a stranger in a bar. And that stranger tells her a story of an old creature that her grandma used to tell her stories about. And that investigator goes back to her clients and says, yes, it's the boogaloo. I did my research on it. It wasn't the boogaloo, but whatever it was called. And I just go, really? They just decided that's what it was from her talking to one stranger at a bar. And then that's just what they decided to call it throughout the rest of the show. Maybe in a world where you've never seen that sort of thing before, you just don't have a word for it. If monsters truly rose amongst us, maybe we'd just call them all zombies because we're not really interested in nomenclature at the time.
Thanks, Ryan from Dallas, for your email. And our final email for the week comes from Chris Davis, and it is also addressed to the King Bee.
Hey, y'all. I love the show, and I love Lovecraft Country so far. A longtime listener, first-time emailer. I loved your commentary as usual on the first episode on Twitch, but I gotta say something King B said about 21 minutes in that struck a chord with me. In his own words, can sci-fi and horror be a great genre for dealing with really heavy racist issues? As a Black man who is a fan of genre content, I have to say yes. Yes. 1,000 times yes. George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, Candyman, the OG Stan Lee X-Men comics, Black Panther, Us, Get Out. Sci-fi and horror have been used to deal with the darkest pieces of human nature and history. From murder to world war and mass genocide, why would it be less equipped to deal with racism? I can't speak for every Black person, but I know a good portion of us are tired of what we call struggle movies. Films like 12 Years a Slave and Birth of a Nation that are sort of dour and somber and usually made purely for Academy Awards. They have their place and merit, but it's exhausting to have most of your representation in media come from the same genre of film set in the same 3 time periods: 1800s America, 1960s America, modern day America. It's great to see a show where Black people get to be involved in the same sci-fi horror shenanigans that our white counterparts get up to. As a Black person who also wants to create genre content, it's just a little infuriating to still hear the power of sci-fi and horror doubted, even after decades of proving itself. Sci-fi and horror are perfectly suited to explore issues of racism, and the more we have shows like Lovecraft Country, the better. Hopefully, I accurately represented B's thoughts and didn't make you a straw man. Let me know if I did. Much love to you all, Chris Davis.
Hey, Chris, thanks so much for writing in. I definitely need to clarify. I was having a conversation with Ash and Jean before the show started, and I feel I made some very cogent points. Once we got into the show, I got a little befuddled and messed it all up. To clarify, a lot of these genres or properties are excellent opportunities for representation and exploration of these issues. But when multiple messages or themes present themselves, good storytelling dictates that one takes a backseat to the other. The Black protagonist in The Living Dead is still a movie that's more about zombies, but you get this great representation. X-Men comics are all subtext. Issues of racial disharmony or bigotry take a backseat to the guy with laser eyes that fights the guy with the helmet. I'd argue that Get Out is a movie about racial resentment and appropriation with a paranormal thriller as the background or setting. And as I see it, Us, which was one of my favorite movies that year, is an amazing horror film, beautifully cast with Black protagonists. It's only a statement because we let it become one. Or maybe I'm just noticing and marveling at a Black family because I've never fucking seen one in a movie like this. The subtext there is, I should be embarrassed that I'm thinking, well, isn't that nice, when it should just be the norm. To get away from the topic of movies with a racial component, think about Alien. It's a fantastic film that speaks volumes to the cold, indifferent, and evil power of giant corporations, but really we're all there for the slimy alien running around in the dark. You can't be everything at once, and my issue with the show was, what are we really focused on? Are we looking at racial disharmony? Or are we shining a light on how things were for the people of this time and place? Or are we looking at eldritch horror and mystic beings in this strange pulp adventure? You can't carry too much at once and be good at everything, if that makes sense.
And King B, I think that also points to something we noticed early on before we even saw a single episode of Lovecraft Country, which is look at the people making this show. You've got this mishmash. It's J.J. Abrams and Jordan Peele. You got Bad Robot and you've got Monkey Paw. And it's like, the tendency, especially if you've done a podcast on several TV shows like we have, is to pigeonhole it into something that we've seen before, to give it a name, give it a genre, give it an intent. And guys, we are still in episode 1. There's a lot to be seen. I posted the question on Twitter, is this better than The Watchmen after one episode? And people were like, dude, it's one episode. Like, give it some time to prove itself. And so I think it's only fair. I mean, we're just getting started with this season of the pod. We get better as we go. Maybe the show will as well. And that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Lovecraft Country. Thank you, everyone who wrote in, everyone who listened, everybody who joined Lovecraft Live with us on Twitch. We hope you enjoyed and will join us next week for more. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatontv.com. Again, if you'd like to write in, you might get on the deep dive. You might get on Shappy Hour, which happens on Fridays. We'll be reading letters there as well. Or maybe even on Lovecraft Live on Sundays. You can email us at host@shatontv.com or call us at 914-719-SHAT. Also, if you'd like to join us all week long on Twitch, we're on shatontv.com/Twitch. As a note, we are taking a vacation this week on Twitch, so we will not be back until Sunday. But join Ash and the King Bee on Sunday for Lovecraft Live. Wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please leave a review. We are a young podcast that will help the podcast grow. Nothing helps like reviews help. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ashley Schlafly and the King Bee, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us on Sunday night for Lovecraft Live on Twitch as we cover the second episode of Lovecraft Country, Whitey's on the Moon.
I fucking love Gil Scott-Heron.
Until then, stay safe and stay the fuck at home.